Young woman disrespects veteran teacher at school, then learns his history. Emily Langston had lived in Chicago her entire life. A 17-year-old high school senior, she was a fixture at Lincoln Park High, known for her confidence, quick wit, and a social media presence that kept her at the center of her circle of friends. She wasn't particularly interested in being a standout student, but she had a natural intelligence that allowed her to get by with minimal effort. Her grades were solid, though she rarely put in more than a few hours of work each week. Most of the time, school felt like a long stretch of monotonous days that she could coast through without much difficulty. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Her life revolved around a familiar routine: wake up, get ready, and then head out the door. At school, she would check her phone between classes, joking with her friends about the latest trends, complaining about teachers, and texting during lessons. It was the kind of high school experience that many people might envy: carefree, easy, with just enough challenge to make things interesting. But it was also empty. Emily didn't have a strong sense of direction. She wasn't passionate about her future, nor did she have a specific dream she was working toward. She simply wanted to enjoy life, be popular, and, most importantly, avoid anything that felt too demanding or hard. Among the many faces of high school, there was one teacher Emily was especially indifferent to: Mr. Jones, her history teacher. He had been teaching at Lincoln Park for as long as anyone could remember, but he seemed ancient to Emily. His gray hair, worn glasses, and slow, deliberate way of speaking only reinforced her impression that he was out of touch with the fast-paced world that she and her classmates inhabited. He wasn't like other teachers who tried to be cool or relatable. No, Mr. Jones was rigid, formal, and most notably old-fashioned. Emily didn't know exactly how old Mr. Jones was, but he was older than most of the teachers at the school, and he had a reputation for being tough. Some of the other students joked about his outdated teaching methods and how he seemed stuck in the past. His history lectures were long and detailed, often filled with names, dates, and places that Emily found to be irrelevant to her world. What use was it to memorize the specifics of ancient wars, especially when she was far more concerned with things like her next Instagram post, the latest gossip about her friends, or how to make the most of the upcoming weekend? History, to Emily, was just something that happened long ago and had no bearing on her life now. She had no particular interest in the subject, and Mr. Jones didn't help matters. His voice was calm, measured, and devoid of the energy that other teachers put into making their subjects feel exciting or relevant. When he stood at the front of the class and began his usual lecture, Emily would often tune him out, letting her mind wander to other, more pressing matters, like the party she was planning for the next Saturday, or how she could convince her parents to let her borrow the car that weekend. Mr. Jones' classroom was a place where Emily felt she could afford to zone out. No one would call on her to answer a question, and even if they did, it wasn't like she would struggle. History was one of the easier subjects for her, and she could rely on the notes her friends took or the occasional glance at a textbook to get by. In fact, Emily had built a bit of a reputation for herself in Mr. Jones' class. She wasn't overtly disruptive, but she made her dissatisfaction known. She would sometimes whisper sarcastic comments to her friends, rolling her eyes when Mr. Jones would start talking about military history or his old school methods. "This guy's totally living in the past," she'd mutter under her breath. "Why does he keep talking about these wars that happened like a million years ago?" She was never cruel, just dismissive. To her, Mr. Jones was an embodiment of everything that was irrelevant in her world, a relic of a time when history seemed important but now felt like a distant echo. Her friends agreed with her. They would often commiserate about how boring his class was, occasionally mocking his old man habits. Emily would say things like, "I bet he still writes on a chalkboard," or "I can't believe this guy's teaching us about stuff that no one cares about." Everyone in the class seemed to share her perspective. She wasn't alone in her judgment of Mr. Jones. In fact, it was almost a point of pride among her group of friends to be the most disaffected and the most vocal critics of his methods. History was one of those classes that they all knew they could breeze through, and the fact that Mr. Jones was an easy target just made it more fun. Despite her apathy toward Mr. Jones, Emily's relationship with her classmates was solid. She was well-liked, charming, and always had something interesting to say. She was known for being quick-witted and funny, the kind of person who always had a joke or a sarcastic comment at the ready. She could make anyone laugh, and that made her popular. She had a tight-knit group of friends who had been with her through the ups and downs of high school. They supported each other through the drama, the school dances, and the occasional crush. But there was something about Emily's interactions with Mr. Jones that made her feel uneasy, even though she would never admit it to anyone. Deep down, Emily knew there was something wrong with how she viewed him, but she had never felt the need to change. After all, it wasn't like she was being malicious. She just didn't care. History class was just a hurdle she had to get through before she could move on to more exciting things. She wasn't one to worry about things like respect or making connections with teachers. She wasn't trying to get into a prestigious college or follow any specific career path. Emily's world was more about living in the moment, being the center of attention, and enjoying the freedom of being a teenager in a big city like Chicago. Her comfortable life, however, was beginning to show cracks, though she didn't yet recognize it. The easy days of high school, the friends, the parties, the endless stream of texts, were beginning to feel less fulfilling. Emily didn't know what she wanted to do after graduation, and this uncertainty started to make her anxious. She didn't want to admit it, not even to herself, but something about the future was starting to scare her. The carefree attitude she had relied on for so long was becoming harder to maintain. The constant pressure to keep up appearances, to be the one everyone looked to for entertainment or validation, was taking a toll. The questions about what came next began to surface, but they were quickly pushed down with the latest distraction, whatever could take her mind off of the nagging feeling that she wasn't prepared for what life would throw at her. But despite the growing discontent, Emily stayed in her comfort zone. She continued to mock Mr. Jones when he wasn't looking, continued to zone out during history class, and kept her focus on her friends and social media. She felt in control of her life. Everything was as it should be. The future could wait. High school, and the predictable routine it offered, was enough for now. However, Emily had no idea how close she was to a moment that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and about the people around her. Mr. Jones, though, remained a constant in the background of her life. His class was just another part of the school day, predictable, unchanging, and unimportant in the grand scheme of things. She wasn't aware of it, but Emily's casual disrespect for him was about to be tested in a way she never saw coming. One moment, one assembly, would shatter the image she had so carefully crafted of her life and force her to confront the things she had been avoiding. But for now, in her comfortable bubble, Emily couldn't have known how much was about to change. It was Friday afternoon, the end of the school week, and Emily Langston was already thinking ahead to the weekend. She had spent the entire day zoning in and out of various classes, her mind distracted by the thought of the party she and her friends were hosting that evening. She had big plans that involved fun, laughter, and the kind of effortless popularity she was used to. History class, which always seemed to drag on forever, was just a small hurdle she needed to get through before the weekend could officially begin. The classroom was filled with the usual chatter as the bell rang, signaling the start of another hour with Mr. Jones. The same familiar routine unfolded. Mr. Jones standing at the front, his glasses perched on his nose, a stack of papers on his desk. Emily barely looked up as he started the lesson, his voice dull and steady, droning on about the aftermath of the Iraq War. Emily glanced around the room, catching the eye of a few of her friends who shared the same bored expressions. Her friend Kate leaned over, her whispering voice cutting through the dull lecture. "Can you believe this guy?" Kate muttered, rolling her eyes. "He's still talking about Iraq like it's the most important thing in the world. Who cares anymore?" Emily gave a short, dismissive laugh.
Exactly.
Like, we're in 2024, right? This is all ancient history. Who even remembers it? She shrugged as she reached for her phone, hiding it beneath her desk. I mean, it's not like any of us are going to end up in the military, right? Why does he keep going on and on about this stuff? She knew Mr. Jones was probably too focused on his lecture to notice, but Emily couldn't help herself. She wasn't the only one who thought the lesson was a waste of time, and it was becoming harder to keep quiet. The more she listened to his monotone voice, the more her disinterest grew. In her mind, this was just another example of an outdated teacher stuck in a world of history that was irrelevant to her generation. What was the point of memorizing dates and events when none of it seemed to connect to her life? She glanced at her phone, half tempted to check Instagram for updates from her friends, when something caught her attention. Mr. Jones had started talking about the human cost of war, casualties, soldiers' sacrifices, the heavy toll of the years-long conflict. Emily didn't understand why anyone would care so much about a distant conflict that didn't affect her. It felt distant, disconnected, and irrelevant to her world. She stared at the back of Mr. Jones' head, his balding scalp catching the light, and couldn't help but mutter under her breath, "Why does he act like this war is so important? It's not like we're out there fighting or anything." As she spoke, she wasn't expecting anyone to hear. But the classroom was quiet enough that her voice traveled. Just as she finished speaking, she noticed Mr. Jones' glance toward her. There was something different in his eyes, something sharp and silent. For a moment, Emily felt the weight of his gaze, but she quickly shrugged it off, thinking he hadn't really heard her. Mr. Jones continued with his lecture, unfazed, and Emily felt a small twinge of irritation. Why couldn't he just move on to something else? Why was he so fixated on this boring, old material? After class, as the bell rang and everyone began to gather their things, Emily walked out with her group of friends, her mind already racing ahead to the weekend. The conversation quickly turned to plans for the party that evening, and the collective excitement of her group was palpable. They discussed the guest list, what drinks to buy, and who would bring what. It was the kind of event that Emily loved, fun, easy, and without any serious commitments or responsibilities. The world outside of high school felt far away and irrelevant, especially as her social circle centered around moments like this. Later that day, just before lunch, Emily checked her phone again, scrolling through messages from friends about the party. Then a notification popped up that caught her attention. The school had announced a special assembly in honor of Veterans Day. As the announcement went on, Emily's disinterest flared. Great, another assembly, she thought, rolling her eyes. This is going to be so boring. Just another long, drawn-out speech about some war stuff I don't care about. The assembly was scheduled for the following Monday, and the theme was, unsurprisingly, honoring heroes in our community. The announcement didn't specify much beyond the fact that the school was planning to highlight the contributions of local veterans and members of the military. To Emily, this sounded like the epitome of tedium. She wasn't interested in veterans or the military, let alone hearing a long, drawn-out history lesson about things that didn't impact her world. All she could think about was the party, how she'd be spending her time with her friends, the music, the social media posts that would follow. That was where Emily felt most alive, not in some dull, obligatory ceremony. Emily's thoughts continued to wander as she went through the motions of the rest of the school day. It was hard for her to focus on much else when the weekend was just around the corner. She sat through lunch with her friends, making jokes and complaining about the assembly. Kay was already making predictions about how boring it would be. "I bet it's just some old guy giving a speech about his days in the military," Kate said, dramatically rolling her eyes. Emily chuckled. "Ugh, yeah. Like we've never heard that before. So tired of hearing about people's brave sacrifices. How many times do we have to listen to this?" Little did Emily know, those words would come back to haunt her. The following Monday, when the assembly began, Emily was in no mood for any of it. She took her seat in the gymnasium with her usual crew, all of them whispering and making jokes about how long the event was going to last. The gymnasium was packed with students, most of whom looked just as uninterested as Emily. She could hear the murmur of voices, people commenting on how much they'd rather be anywhere else, texting or chatting with friends. Emily was distracted, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could make the experience less unbearable. Finally, the principal stepped up to the microphone, beginning the formalities. He mentioned the importance of the assembly and the significance of honoring veterans, but Emily barely heard a word of it. She looked around, waiting for the moment when they could finally leave. She shifted in her seat, scrolling through her phone, when the principal suddenly introduced a speaker, Mr. Jones, our history teacher, who has a unique story to share with us today. At first, Emily didn't think anything of it. Mr. Jones? Seriously? She thought, a mix of amusement and disdain crossing her mind. She had no idea why he was chosen to speak at the assembly. If anything, she expected him to be awkward, perhaps to ramble on about some aspect of history that no one cared about. To her surprise, as Mr. Jones stepped onto the stage, there was a shift in the air. He wasn't the same old, boring teacher she had grown used to. He stood tall and composed, a stark contrast to the man who had been lecturing her about ancient battles. For the first time, Emily noticed something in his posture, something commanding. The gymnasium grew quieter as Mr. Jones began to speak, and Emily couldn't help but listen. His words weren't about ancient wars or boring history. He spoke with a calm but steady authority, recounting his time as a soldier in Iraq. He shared stories about his experiences, the friendships he had formed, the things he had witnessed, and the sacrifices he had made. Emily was taken aback. She hadn't expected this. She had always thought of Mr. Jones as just a teacher, someone who droned on about dates and events she could barely relate to. But as he spoke, she began to see a different side of him. He talked about the horrors of war, the long days in the desert, the fear, the uncertainty. He spoke of the comrades he had lost and the impact those losses had on him. Emily's usual disinterest was replaced by something she couldn't quite place. Respect, maybe? Or guilt. She didn't know. But she knew one thing. This was no longer just a teacher talking about history. This was a man who had lived through things she could never even begin to imagine. As the assembly continued, Emily couldn't shake the weight of what she had heard. She had been so dismissive of Mr. Jones, so quick to judge him for things she didn't understand. And now, here he was, sharing parts of his life that had clearly shaped who he was. The veteran, the teacher. She had never considered how those identities might have intersected, how the man in front of her had lived a life so vastly different from her own. That afternoon, when the assembly ended, Emily left the gymnasium in a daze. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Jones and the story he had shared. His words resonated in a way that surprised her. For the first time, she felt the sting of regret for the way she had dismissed him. The world of history, of soldiers, of sacrifice, it wasn't just a subject. It was real. And she realized that she had been blind to its significance. As she walked through the halls of Lincoln Park High, the usual banter with her friends didn't feel as satisfying. Emily's mind kept returning to Mr. Jones. She had no idea how to process what had just happened, but one thing was clear. She had underestimated him, and in doing so, she had underestimated everything he had been through. The Monday after the assembly, Emily woke up with a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. The weekend had been a blur of parties, friends, and social media posts. Yet something about the past week had stuck with her. Mr. Jones' speech was still fresh in her mind, more so than anything else she'd experienced over the weekend. She hadn't really talked to anyone about it yet, but she couldn't shake the nagging sense that she had been wrong about him. Her mind kept returning to his words, the way he had spoken with such depth and authenticity about his experiences. It was a side of him she had never seen before, and it had left her feeling unsettled. As Emily got ready for school, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in Mr. Jones' eyes when he had talked about his time in Iraq. The man who had seemed so dry, so distant, was now someone whose life seemed imbued with meaning she had never considered. What struck her most was how she had dismissed him so casually, how easy it had been to write him off as just another old teacher when in reality, he was so much more than that. Emily had never truly thought about the impact of war on the people who fought in it. She had always considered history as something distant, something academic, something she could learn, forget, and move on from. But now, that view felt incomplete. There was a weight to the world beyond high school that she had never acknowledged. That morning, Emily sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her coffee as her thoughts wandered. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her reverie. It was a message from Kate, one of her close friends. "So, what are we doing for the party on Friday? You're still coming, right?" Emily hesitated before replying, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't know how to explain it. The party seemed trivial now, a distraction from something that was gnawing at her. She wasn't sure how to articulate it, how to explain the change that was happening inside her. So, instead of texting back immediately, he just set the phone down and finished her coffee in silence. She didn't feel excited about the weekend plans anymore, not the way she used to. Something had shifted, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. When she arrived at school, Emily felt oddly out of place. The hallways, the chatter, the lockers, it all felt distant, almost irrelevant. Her friends were still buzzing with excitement about the weekend, but Emily was struggling to engage. As the day dragged on, she kept finding herself glancing over at Mr. Jones' classroom door. It was as if she could feel his presence there, even though he wasn't teaching that day. Emily knew she would have to confront him sooner or later, but she wasn't sure how. What could she say? How could she apologize for the way she had dismissed him? It wasn't like she could just walk up to him and say, "I'm sorry for thinking you were boring and irrelevant." By lunchtime, Emily's unease had reached a boiling point. She had made a half-hearted attempt to engage with her friends, but the conversation kept drifting back to topics she didn't care about. Kay was talking about some new influencer, and Lizzie was updating everyone on the latest drama about who was dating whom. Emily had zoned out, staring at her lunch tray, when something made her stand up suddenly. "I need to go to the library," she announced. Her friends looked at her quizzically. "The library? What for?" Kate asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "I don't know, just need to be alone for a bit," Emily replied. "I'll catch up with you guys later." She grabbed her bag and left the cafeteria without waiting for a response. Her legs carried her mechanically down the halls to the library, the usual sounds of the school fading into the background. When she arrived, she found a quiet corner near the windows and sat down. The shelves of books around her seemed to offer a kind of solace, though she wasn't sure why. She wasn't there to study. She wasn't even sure why she was there at all. All she knew was that she needed space to think. She couldn't shake the feeling that something in her life was changing, and she didn't know how to process it. For the next hour, Emily sat alone, paging through a book she barely noticed. Her thoughts were a jumble of conflicting emotions, guilt for the way she had treated Mr. Jones, confusion about her own place in the world, and a deepening sense of frustration with the way everything in her life had seemed so easy up until now. She had spent so much time focusing on her image, her popularity, and her social life that she had completely overlooked the complexity of the world around her. She had thought the things that mattered to her were the only things that mattered, but now she realized how limited her perspective had been. As the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, Emily left the library feeling unsettled. She walked down the hallway, her eyes scanning the floor as she moved. It wasn't until she passed Mr. Jones' classroom door that she stopped. For a moment, she stood there, her hand hovering over the doorknob, her heart racing. She had no plan, no idea what she was going to say if she went inside. But before she could make up her mind, the door opened, and Mr. Jones walked out into the hall, holding a stack of papers in his hands. His eyes met Emily's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily was struck by the change in him. He wasn't the same teacher she had seen in class. This man felt different, more human, somehow. His posture was relaxed, his eyes thoughtful, and there was a kind of quiet strength in the way he held himself. "Emily," he said, his voice steady, but not unfriendly. "I've been meaning to talk to you." She looked up at him, her throat dry. I'm sorry," she blurted out before she could stop herself.
"For what I said the other day."
"I didn't know. I didn't understand." Mr. Jones regarded her for a moment, his eyes softening slightly. "I know you didn't," he said, his voice gentle. "But sometimes it takes a little while to see things differently. We all have our perspectives, and sometimes it takes something, or someone, to help us expand them." "I don't know how I could have been so ignorant," Emily admitted, her voice faltering. She had never been one to admit fault, especially not in front of someone she had always dismissed. But now, she couldn't deny the discomfort in her own words. "I just never thought about what you went through." "I understand," Mr. Jones said quietly. "It's easy to forget that people have stories, especially when we're caught up in our own. But every person we meet, every lesson we learn, it all connects in some way. History isn't just about the past, it's about how we understand the present. Emily nodded, absorbing his words. She didn't fully understand yet, but something in his tone made her feel like she was standing at the edge of a larger world, a world she hadn't been ready to explore. "I'd like to tell you more about it if you're interested," Mr. Jones continued. "Not just as your teacher, but as someone who's lived it. It might help you see things differently. History can be more than dates and facts. It's about people." Emily swallowed, the weight of his offer settling on her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, answers, perhaps, or just a better understanding of what she had dismissed. She hadn't expected this conversation, but it felt like the beginning of something. I think I'd like that," she said quietly. Mr. Jones smiled faintly. "We can start after school, if you're free. I'm always here." That evening, Emily walked home with a new sense of determination. The weight of the day felt different now, less like a burden and more like an opportunity. As she thought about the conversation with Mr. Jones, she realized that her world was much larger than she had ever imagined. She had entered unfamiliar territory, a world where understanding, empathy, and perspective were more valuable than social status or fleeting distractions. And somehow, that felt like the start of something important. Emily struggles to comprehend the depth of Mr. Jones' experience. The following days at school felt different to Emily. There was a noticeable shift in how she moved through the halls, how she interacted with her friends, even how she felt about the world around her. It wasn't that her friends had changed, or that school suddenly seemed unbearable. It was that Emily had changed, albeit in ways she couldn't yet fully grasp. Every conversation, every social media post, every casual remark from her peers seemed to pale in comparison to what she had started to understand through Mr. Jones' stories. It was Wednesday afternoon when Emily finally found herself walking down the same quiet hallway toward Mr. Jones' classroom after school. She was nervous but determined. The conversation from Monday had left her feeling exposed, as if she were standing on the edge of something vast, something unknown. She had a lot of questions, but she wasn't sure where to begin. As she reached the door to Mr. Jones' classroom, she hesitated for a moment. Her heart beat a little faster. Was she ready to dive deeper into this new world? It was easier to stay in her bubble, to ignore the complexities of life beyond high school. But then, she thought about his words, the invitation he had extended to her. She had agreed, hadn't she? And now, here she was about to step into something bigger than herself. She knocked softly on the door, and Mr. Jones called out from within, "Come in, Emily." She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty except for Mr. Jones, who was sitting behind his desk, organizing papers. He smiled when he saw her. "I'm glad you came." Emily gave him a small smile in return, though she still felt uncertain. She took a seat across from him, feeling the weight of the moment settle between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was almost as if they were both waiting for something, perhaps a sign that this conversation could proceed without awkwardness. Finally, Mr. Jones broke the silence. "So, Emily, what's on your mind?" Emily shifted in her seat, searching for the right words. She had 1,000 questions, but none of them felt like they would fully capture what she was feeling. How could she explain this sense of unease, this nagging feeling that her understanding of the world had been incomplete? She had spent so much of her life focusing on what was easy, what was convenient, so much so that she hadn't thought to ask deeper questions. "I guess I don't really know where to start," Emily admitted. "I just feel like I didn't understand, like I didn't get it, what you've been through, what this history is really about." Mr. Jones nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's okay. Most people don't. History can seem distant when you don't have a personal connection to it. But when you've lived through it, it changes everything. And that's not something you can easily teach in a classroom." He paused, his gaze shifting as if reflecting on something far beyond the walls of the school. When you're fighting in a war, or when you're part of something larger than yourself, you start to understand the complexities of the world. You learn that things aren't just black and white. That everything, people, events, choices, is tangled up in shades of gray. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, you can't fully make sense of it. Emily listened intently, her mind racing. She had always thought of history as something to memorize, to compartmentalize dates, names, events. But now, she was beginning to understand that history wasn't just a series of disconnected facts. It was lived. It was personal. And in many ways, it was painful. "Did you always want to join the military?" Emily asked, the question slipping out before she had time to second-guess herself. It was an innocent question, but one she realized held deeper significance. She had never thought about why someone would choose that path, especially someone like Mr. Jones, who now seemed so distant from the strict, sometimes cold teacher she had known before. Mr. Jones seemed to consider her question for a moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't always want to join the military. I was a college student when 9/11 happened. Like a lot of people, I was just trying to figure out what I was doing with my life. But when that happened, it changed everything. Suddenly, there was a war, a real one, and it felt like the world was changing around me in ways I couldn't ignore." He leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling for a moment, as though recalling something painful. "I joined because I felt like I had to. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch the world burn. I thought that by joining, I could make a difference. I could be part of something bigger than myself." Emily sat quietly, absorbing his words. She had never thought about war in that way, had never thought about the personal decision behind someone choosing to fight. To her, war had always seemed like something distant, something political. She never imagined that soldiers could be motivated by a sense of duty, or even by a desire to protect others. "What was it like?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Being there, in Iraq." Mr. Jones exhaled slowly, and for the first time, Emily saw the weight of his experience on his face. It was hard to describe. You think you know what war is like, but you don't. You can't. Until you're there, you can't possibly understand. It's not just the danger, it's the constant fear, the uncertainty, the exhaustion, and the guilt. The guilt of knowing that you're killing people, even when you believe it's for the right reasons. He paused, letting the silence hang between them. Emily felt herself sinking into that silence, as though the space between them was growing heavier with each passing second. She had always lived in a world where her biggest concerns were grades, social status, and whether her Instagram posts got enough likes. But now, she was sitting in front of a man who had lived through something much more profound, much more painful than anything she had ever known. "What do you mean by guilt?" she asked quietly. Mr. Jones looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "When you're out there, fighting for survival, you do things that you never imagined you'd have to do. You make choices, hard choices that haunt you. You wonder if it was worth it. You wonder if you could have done something differently. You wonder if the people you're fighting against are any different from you." He rubbed his eyes, and Emily noticed a slight tremor in his hands. "It changes you, in ways you don't expect. You come home, and you realize you can't just go back to the life you had before. You can't just pick up where you left off because you're not the same person anymore. And the world around you, it hasn't changed.
People don't get it.
They don't see what you've been through." For the first time, Emily understood. She had spent her whole life thinking that the most important thing was getting through high school, getting the best grades, attending the best college. But now, sitting here with Mr. Jones, she realized how small and insignificant those worries were in the grand scheme of things. There was a depth to his words that Emily couldn't ignore. War wasn't just an event in history. It was a personal, painful experience that left permanent scars. "Is that why you became a teacher?" Emily asked, her voice tentative. "To help people understand? To make sense of it all?" Mr. Jones nodded slowly, his eyes focusing on her with a kind of quiet intensity.
"Partly.
I wanted to make sure that people understood that history isn't just something in a textbook. It's about people. It's about choices. And I wanted to give students like you a chance to see the bigger picture, to understand that there's more to the world than what's right in front of you. That the world is complicated, and sometimes the answers aren't easy." Emily sat back in her chair, her mind spinning with everything he had said. She had come into this conversation expecting to find answers, But now, she realized that there were no simple answers, only layers of complexity, each one revealing more questions. The world was not as simple as she had once thought. And yet, that realization was strangely liberating. "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand," Emily said, her voice quieter now, "but I'm starting to get it. That history isn't just dates and facts. It's real. It's people. It's pain." Mr. Jones smiled, a faint but genuine expression. "That's a good place to start, Emily. Understanding that is the first step toward making sense of the world around you." Emily left Mr. Jones' classroom that afternoon with a heavy heart and a mind full of new realizations. What had started as a simple curiosity about history had quickly expanded into something far more profound, a deep, unsettling journey into the complexities of war, sacrifice, and the human condition. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was seeing the world for what it truly was, a tangled web of pain, choices, and consequences far beyond the confines of high school drama and adolescent trivialities. Over the next few days, Emily became more and more absorbed by her conversations with Mr. Jones. They met after school several times, and each time, he peeled back more layers of his experience in Iraq. He talked about his comrades, men and women who had become like family to him during the darkest days of his deployment. He described the heat, the dust, and the endless nights spent in the shadow of fear and uncertainty. He spoke about the surreal feeling of being in a place where nothing felt real, where survival was the only constant, and where every day brought new challenges and new horrors. For Emily, each new story was a revelation. She had never realized how disconnected she had been from the realities of the world. It wasn't just Mr. Jones' experiences that shook her, it was the way she had lived her life. So focused on the superficial, the small, the inconsequential. She found herself questioning everything she had once taken for granted. Was it really important to be popular? To have a perfect Instagram feed? To fit in with a crowd? She had been so concerned with her own image, her own fleeting sense of importance, that she had missed the bigger picture entirely. And yet, as she learned more about the complexities of war and history, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had sought answers, and now she was getting them. She could see the world from a new perspective, a perspective shaped by the lessons Mr. Jones had shared with her. She was no longer just another high school student obsessed with fitting in. She was beginning to understand the weight of history, the importance of sacrifice, and the unacknowledged struggles that people like Mr. Jones had endured. But there was something unsettling in this new understanding. It was as if she had stumbled onto something that was too big for her to grasp, a truth too painful to fully absorb. As much as she learned, there was always more to uncover, and each revelation seemed to lead to new questions, new doubts, and new uncertainties. Emily felt as though she were standing at the edge of an abyss, peering into a world of darkness and complexity that she could never fully understand. One afternoon, as she sat in the library reading through her history textbook, Emily's phone buzzed with a text message from Kate. "Hey, are you still coming to the party on Friday?" it read. Emily stared at the screen, feeling a strange disconnect. The party, the usual weekend plans, they suddenly seemed so unimportant. The questions that had been consuming her were far bigger than anything that could be answered by a night of loud music and meaningless conversation. She typed back quickly. "I don't think I'm going to make it. I've got other plans." A few seconds later, Kate's reply came. "Oh, okay. You okay? You've been kind of off lately." Emily read the message and hesitated before putting her phone down. She wasn't sure how to explain the changes in her mindset, the way her thoughts had shifted in recent days. How could she tell Kate that she no longer cared about the things they had always cared about? How could she explain that she was no longer interested in the party scene, in the endless cycle of social media posts, or in the drama that seemed to define her friends' lives? The truth was, she didn't know how to explain it. She didn't even fully understand it herself. It was as though she had woken up to a new reality, one that was more complicated, more difficult, and more real than anything she had ever known. And in some ways, that was exhilarating. But in others, it was overwhelming. Later that afternoon, As Emily walked down the hall to meet Mr. Jones for their latest meeting, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. She had finally begun to understand. She had wanted to know what history really meant, to understand the lives of those who lived through it, and now she was getting that knowledge. But the more she learned, the more she realized how much she still didn't know. History wasn't something that could be neatly packaged or easily explained. It was messy, chaotic, and full of contradictions. And even though she was gaining insight, she also felt a growing sense of unease. When she arrived at Mr. Jones' classroom, he was already waiting for her. He smiled when he saw her, but there was a subtle shift in his expression, something unspoken that made Emily feel like she was crossing into deeper, more uncertain territory. "Are you ready for today's lesson?" Mr. Jones asked, his tone light but serious. Emily nodded, though she didn't feel as confident as she had earlier. She had come to appreciate his lessons, but with each new story he shared, each new perspective he opened her eyes to, she felt a greater sense of responsibility and even fear. What if she couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of what he had experienced? What if, despite everything, she was still too naive to truly understand? "I think so," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "But I'm starting to feel like there's so much more to it than I can wrap my head around. It's like every time I think I get it, I realize I don't." Mr. Jones studied her for a moment, as though evaluating her words. "That's the thing about history, Emily. You never truly get it. It's too vast, too complex. You learn parts of it, pieces of it, but the whole picture is always just out of reach. And that's okay. The point is to keep questioning, to keep searching for answers, even when you know you might never find the final one." Emily absorbed his words, her mind spinning with their implications. For the first time, she realized that perhaps understanding history, or understanding the world, wasn't about finding all the answers. It was about learning to live with the questions, to embrace the uncertainty, and to grow through the process of seeking. This, too, was part of the journey. "That's comforting, I guess," she said quietly, "but also kind of frustrating." Mr. Jones chuckled. "That's the paradox. The more you learn, the more you realize there's always more to know. But that's the beauty of it, too. It keeps you searching, keeps you questioning." The conversation shifted to more specific details about the Iraq War, about the human cost of conflict, the political struggles that define the war's purpose, and the painful reality that many soldiers faced when they returned home. Emily had 1,000 questions, but as Mr. Jones spoke, she realized that no amount of knowledge could ever truly capture the emotional and psychological toll of war. The deeper she dug, the more she realized that she could never fully understand what it felt like to live through those experiences, no matter how many stories she heard. By the end of their meeting, Emily felt both empowered and humbled. She had learned so much, but she also understood that the deeper she delved into the human side of history, the more questions she would uncover, and that some answers would always remain elusive. It was a false victory. She had gained the knowledge she thought she wanted, but with that knowledge came an awareness of the vastness of what she didn't know. And the more she learned, the more she felt that perhaps understanding the world was less about achieving final answers and more about learning to live with the uncertainty, the contradictions, and the complexity. As she walked out of the classroom, Emily felt a strange mix of pride and disquiet. She had wanted to understand, to know the truth about the world, and she was beginning to. But the more she learned, the more she realized that knowing the truth wasn't the same as understanding it. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. The following week felt strangely heavy for Emily. It wasn't that school had become any harder or that she had too many assignments piling up. It wasn't even the usual stress of teenage drama that was weighing on her. No, it was something else. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but it was there, like a shadow lurking just behind her every thought. It started with a sudden realization that she had begun to distance herself from her old life. Her friends had noticed, and though they tried to be subtle about it, it was clear they were confused. "What's up with you lately?" Kate asked one afternoon during lunch, her eyes narrowing as Emily absent-mindedly stared at her phone, scrolling through a news article about the latest developments in Iraq. "You've been acting weird. You hardly talk about anything fun anymore." Are you, okay? Emily looked up from her phone and gave Kate a weak smile. Yeah, I'm fine, she replied, but her voice felt flat. She knew it wasn't the whole truth. It was as if a veil had lifted from her eyes, and she could no longer see the world through the same lens as before. She wasn't sure how to explain it. How could she tell Kate that what once seemed important, gossip about the latest party, who was dating whom, who had the best outfit, now seemed trivial and fleeting? Or that, for the first time in her life, she felt an overwhelming weight of awareness, a sense of responsibility that she didn't know how to carry. You sure? Kate pressed, raising an eyebrow. You've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Jones, haven't you? What's going on there? Emily's stomach twisted slightly at the mention of Mr. Jones. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to explain the intense conversations they had been having about war, history, and the human cost of it all. She didn't know how to put it into words. How could she explain to Kate that history wasn't just something to memorize for a test or casually discuss over a weekend brunch? How could she describe the emotional impact of learning about the soldiers Mr. Jones had known, the people he had lost, and the psychological scars that shaped him? Instead, Emily just shrugged. It's nothing, she said, her voice cold, even to her own ears. Just some extra credit stuff. Kate stared at her for a moment, then rolled her eyes. If you say so. She didn't press further, but Emily could tell she was disappointed, confused. And Emily felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't being fair to her friends. They hadn't done anything wrong. They hadn't asked for this sudden shift in her perspective. But Emily felt like she was standing at a crossroads between two worlds, the one she had always known, filled with shallow conversations and fleeting concerns, and the one that Mr. Jones had helped her uncover, full of difficult truths and unresolved pain. The more Emily tried to escape the discomfort by returning to her old routine, the more out of place she felt. Her friends' voices, their laughter, the way they texted each other about trivial things, it all seemed so distant now, like a world that didn't quite belong to her anymore. And yet, when she tried to talk to Mr. Jones about the emotional weight she was carrying, about the ways in which his stories had started to haunt her, she felt a sense of hesitation. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was becoming too much of a burden, too eager to learn, too desperate to understand. And there was a part of her that wondered whether Mr. Jones would eventually grow tired of her questions, tired of having to explain the unexplainable. One afternoon, as Emily sat in Mr. Jones' classroom after school, the feeling of unease became overwhelming. She had just finished reading an article about PTSD and its effects on soldiers, and the more she read, the more her stomach churned. She felt trapped in a vortex of empathy and guilt, unable to reconcile her desire to understand with a painful truth that, no matter how much she learned, she would never truly know what it felt like to carry the scars of war. You seem troubled, Mr. Jones said quietly, looking up from the stack of papers he was grading. What's on your mind? Emily hesitated, biting her lip as she tried to organize her thoughts. I've been reading about PTSD, she said slowly, her voice catching slightly. About how soldiers come home and they can't escape the memories of war. How they're haunted by it. And I don't know, Mr. Jones, it feels like I'm drowning in all this. Like, I want to know, but it's just too much. It's like I'm carrying a burden that isn't even mine to bear. Mr. Jones set down his pen, his gaze softening as he studied her. Emily, that's the price of empathy. When you open yourself up to understanding the pain of others, it can feel overwhelming, almost suffocating. You want to help, to make sense of it, but the truth is sometimes there's no neat answer. No easy resolution. History is full of tragedy, and so is life. But the best thing you can do is learn, listen, and try to help those who need it. Not everything has a fix, and not everyone will understand, but the world needs people who are willing to care. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of it all was almost too much. She had thought that learning about history would give her the clarity she sought, that it would answer the questions about why people fought, why they suffered, and what it meant to live in a world torn apart by violence. But the more she learned, the more she realized that history wasn't something to be neatly wrapped up in a bow. It was messy, tragic, and often incomprehensible. The more she understood, the more it hurt. The stories Mr. Jones shared with her were filled with names, real people who had lived and died, and each one of those stories felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I don't know how to carry this," Emily whispered, almost to herself. "I thought I was strong enough, but I don't know if I can handle knowing all of this. It's like the more I learn, the heavier it gets." Mr. Jones was quiet for a long moment, and Emily wondered if he was trying to find the right words to say. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "There's no right way to carry it, Emily. You can't change the past, but you can honor it. You can make sure that the lessons you learn here shape who you become. History doesn't exist for you to feel burdened by it. It exists so you can use it to understand the world better, to help others, to build a future that doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. You can't shoulder all the pain of history, but you can carry a piece of it with you and let it guide you toward making things better." For a long time, Emily sat in silence, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She felt simultaneously enlightened and lost. She had learned so much, but she hadn't anticipated the emotional toll that would come with it. The more she understood about the consequences of war, the more her own sense of helplessness grew. What could she do, after all, with all this knowledge? How could one person make a difference in a world that seemed so broken? And yet, in the midst of her confusion, Emily felt a flicker of something else. Perhaps it wasn't about fixing the world or making all the pain go away. Perhaps it was about bearing witness, about acknowledging the past, and allowing that awareness to shape how she lived her life. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. As she left Mr. Jones' classroom that day, Emily's heart was heavy, but there was also a quiet sense of determination beginning to form within her. She knew now that understanding history wasn't about finding the perfect answer or fixing everything. It was about learning to live with the weight of the world's stories, to let them shape her actions, and to carry them forward in a way that honored the people who had lived and died through them. The final bell of the day rang through the high school hallways, signaling the end of another uneventful school day for most of the students. But for Emily, it felt like the start of something entirely new. She had been walking through the halls for weeks now, but this time, something was different. Everything felt strangely distant and foreign, as if she were now an outsider in a world she had once inhabited so comfortably. As she passed by the crowded lockers and the familiar groups of students gossiping about the latest drama, she realized how much she had changed. Where once she might have laughed along with her friends about the trivialities of high school life, who was dating whom, who wore the most expensive shoes, who was winning the next big game, those conversations no longer held any meaning for her. She had outgrown them in a way. The things she once considered important no longer seemed to matter. Emily had spent the last several weeks diving deep into the stories Mr. Jones had shared with her, the stories of soldiers, of the ravages of war, of people who had given everything and never returned. She had learned more than she could ever have imagined about the cost of history and the emotional toll of conflict. She had come to understand that the world was more complicated, more tragic, and more beautiful than she had ever realized. But now, as she stood in the middle of the same high school she had walked through for years, she felt like she was seeing it with new eyes. She wondered, how could she return to the life she had known? The life where friends fretted over prom dresses and what to post on Instagram, when she had just discovered a world of pain, sacrifice, and loss that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend? How could she go back to pretending that everything was fine when, in the quietest moments, she carried the weight of so many untold stories, of so many lives lost in a war she couldn't change? That evening, Emily met up with her friends at their usual hangout spot, a small cafe downtown where they often spent hours gossiping over coffee. As they gathered around a table, laughing and chatting about the latest news in their lives, Emily felt a deep sense of disconnection. She tried to engage in the conversation, to laugh along with them, but it all felt so hollow. Her mind kept drifting back to the stories Mr. Jones had shared, the images of soldiers coming home broken, of families torn apart, of people who had never asked for the violence that had invaded their lives. "Emily, are you even listening?" Kate's voice broke through her thoughts, snapping her back to the present. "You've been kind of out of it lately. What's going on?" Emily looked up at her friends, their faces filled with concern. She could tell that they were trying to reach her, but it was like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out at a landscape they couldn't see. She had once been right there with them, focused on the same things, worried about the same problems. But now, everything had shifted. The things they cared about no longer seemed important, and she didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. "I'm just tired," Emily said with a sigh, offering them a weak smile. "I guess I've just been thinking about other stuff. You know, life." Life. Kate raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying the explanation. "You've been really off lately. We miss having you around, You're like a totally different person." Emily swallowed hard, feeling a twinge of guilt. She had always prided herself on being the life of the group, always up for a laugh or a night out. But now, everything felt different. "I guess I'm just growing up," she said quietly. "Things are changing. I don't know how to explain it." Her friends exchanged looks, but no one pushed her further. They weren't used to her being so distant, and they certainly didn't understand what she had been through in the past few weeks. They had no idea that Emily had been spending her afternoons with Mr. Jones, learning about the complexities of war, history, and the human condition. They didn't know that she had been forced to confront painful truths about the world, truths that left her feeling both empowered and utterly lost. The evening dragged on, and Emily couldn't shake the sense of alienation that had settled over her. She tried to laugh, to engage in the conversations, but it felt forced. Her mind kept returning to Mr. Jones' classroom, to the stories of soldiers and families, to the countless lives that had been touched by conflict. How could she return to a life that seemed so disconnected from the realities she now knew? How could she engage in trivial conversations when she knew that so many people, like the soldiers Mr. Jones had described, were struggling with far more important issues? As the evening came to a close, Emily said her goodbyes and walked out into the cool night air. The world around her felt muted, as if the noise and chaos of high school had faded into the background. She realized, with a sudden clarity, that she couldn't go back to the way things were. She had changed, grown in a way, and the world she had once inhabited didn't quite fit her anymore. The people she had once called friends seemed distant now, their concerns so far removed from the reality of what she had learned. But even as she felt that sense of alienation, Emily knew deep down that she couldn't abandon them entirely. The truth was, she still cared about them, even if she couldn't connect with them in the same way she had before. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this was the heart of the lesson she had learned over the past few weeks. The world was messy. It was complicated. People suffered, people loved, people lost, and people moved on. History was full of contradictions, and the truth was never as clear as she had once imagined. But that didn't mean she could ignore it. It didn't mean she could shut herself off from the world she had known just because it no longer made sense to her. The real test, she realized, was not in the knowledge she had gained, nor in the dramatic shift in her perspective, but in how she would move forward from here. She had seen the world for what it was: messy, painful, and sometimes hopeless. But she had also seen the possibility of change. She had seen how one person, even if they couldn't fix everything, could make a difference. And that's what she had to hold on to. Emily's walk home was long, and as she passed through the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she felt a sense of both loss and possibility. The person she had been before, ignorant of the larger world, wrapped up in her own small concerns, was gone. And yet, she couldn't turn away from the people who still lived in that world. Her friends, her family, and even her schoolmates still mattered, even if they didn't fully understand what she had been through. And maybe, just maybe, her new understanding of the world could help her make a difference in their lives as well. She entered her home, greeted by the familiar hum of a house that felt, for the first time in weeks, both comforting and constraining. Her parents were sitting in the living room, watching TV, and her younger brother was buried in his video games. Everything was as it had always been, but Emily felt like a stranger in her own home. She had changed so much, but how could she explain that to them? How could she convey the depth of her transformation when they hadn't shared in her journey? She sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the darkening sky. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen to see a text from Kate. "Hey, just checking in. We miss you. Let's hang out this weekend, okay?" Emily smiled softly, a bittersweet feeling rising in her chest. She had missed them too, in her own way. And maybe this was the first step, learning how to navigate her old world with her new truth. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would. But she had learned something important. Growth wasn't about rejecting the past, but about carrying it with you, using it to shape who you became. She wasn't the same person who had started this journey, but maybe that was okay. With a deep breath, she typed a quick reply. "Sounds good. I'll be there."
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.